She was by far the strictest, hardest teacher in the history of the school. She had been a French and Latin teacher for longer than anyone could remember, and with her inner determination, call it will to continue, everyone knew she would continue teaching long after the best and most tenured teachers would have retired. She did not conceive of retirement. Her life had been teaching since she was a child. The day she stopped teaching would be the day she stopped living. She was a lonely, only child of wealthy doctors who saw fit to educate her at home. A succession of teachers paraded the knowledge of the world before her 6 hours each day. She listened politely, wrote her figures correctly, passed the oral exams with each of the language and literature and science and grace teachers, then went to her room and spent her free time filling the heads of her menagerie of dogs and bears and zebras and China girls and boys with the nonsense that ran through her mind. Her mother dressed her in the severest of gray dresses, with the petticoats starched so as to make sitting or standing impossibly uncomfortable, and told her she was special, that she must be careful who she made friends with at the school, best if she had no friends, yet maintained her integrity. As her mother pushed a white carnation through the buttoned hole in her lapel, she knew that her imagination must rest in that blossom she wore and replaced each day of her life. Because her mother sent her the carnation she was to wear, with explicit instructions, the nuns tolerated her to wear a fresh one each day. The school disappointed her, the classes bored her, she learned too quickly and sat back in her seat daydreaming while the other girls struggled with the numbers or through the declinations. She did not make friends during her first year, nor her second year. No one matched her intellectually, it was true, but no one matched her depth of emotion, and she did feel deeply. There were pranks, hazes, harassments planned, ways to show her that she was not so special, but somehow they all fizzled out before executed. It could have been the strict atmosphere of the school, yet it must have been that even at that age, the girls respected her more than envied her. She was untouched in some special way, touched in another, and finally left alone to wander the halls, reciting words in French and Latin, seeking rhythms, seeking rhymes, to accompany the music that ran constantly through her head, but would not come out of her fingers. Her mother had told the nun she was to have no musical instruction. The piano, the violin, they only squawked like ducks in the cloister when she touched them, as if her touch brought them pain. She was in the school to learn not the facts as the nuns interpreted reality, but how to hold herself above her peers and avoid humiliation. So music lessons were forbidden, for she could not excel and would actually embarrass herself. She and her parents had conceived of only two possible followings for her. One was to be a doctor, as her parents were. The other was to be a teacher, as her grandmother had been. Not an itinerant tutor who went from home to home in shabby shoes, worn out on the doors of the rich, but in the university, the woman's college. None of the three had given thought about Grace entering her life. Grace entered the school in her third year. Grace's father was a fairly well-to-do mathematics teacher who had educated his daughter himself while he saved money for a school he could not truly afford. When Grace wrote home requesting that he send fresh carnations each week, he flatly refused, writing a tersely worded note advising Grace to keep out of the garden where other women lost their heads, and in those studies where Grace could help him to elevate teaching to the professional standards he demanded. She and Grace were of an age, and Grace one day approached her bluntly and asked, "What is it you do with your flower when the day has passed?" in flawless French. She was so surprised, she replied in Latin that she always just threw them away at the end of the day. "Couldn't you put them in water and give them to me the next day to wear?" Nothing of the kind had ever entered her mind. She suddenly looked at the girl standing in front of her, thought if she had had a sister, a twin, Grace would have been that twin, that sister. She found herself saying yes before she could remember to say no. She was not here to make friends, nor share her emotions. She was here to become a doctor or a teacher. My father has decided I should become a teacher. He says teachers are never treated with the respect that they should have. Teachers are always nuns who no one pays, they never accept money, or tutors who are paid poorly by families that can afford to pay better. He says people always respect their doctors. If the doctor says do this, they do it because they feel their life is at stake. If a teacher says do this, they don't mind not doing it. They don't realize their minds are at stake. It was in this moment that she discarded the idea of becoming a doctor entirely. That evening, she and Grace wrote 2 letters. The first, they forged expertly a note from Grace's father that Grace was to be allowed to wear a carnation each day. The second was a letter to her parents, telling them that she had made her decision to be the teacher they expected her to be. In this moment, the girls became friends, deep friends, inseparable friends, with a relationship envied by all more than the carnations they shared. The nuns decided to begin growing carnations in the garden, with additional funds forwarded by the doctors, her parents, and within a year all the girls were required to wear carnations of pink in their lapels. In later years, the carnations became a source of abundant income to the school. It was decided then that both girls would attend the same university in France to continue their goals of being instructors to the young. Grace was to become a voice teacher, music and elocution, and French pronunciation, while she would become a grammarian, Latin and French. They passed 4 rather uneventful years in Paris. She never did anything untoward, but Grace fell in love. This love was no man, though. She controlled Grace's emotional energy. She fell in love with Grace, while Grace fell in love with food, particularly fond of candied hams and French pastries. And these began to accumulate until by the time they were ready to graduate and become full-fledged teachers, Grace weighed more than 120 kilos, was rotund, took 1.5 seats on the train home. She had remained slight, though she had grown tall. She was thin almost to being sickly. Her mother, seeing the 2 of them on the platform, nearly cried out that she might be near death from starvation, but then wisely realized that it was the contrast with Grace, whom her mother would forever think of as Fat Grace, and sometimes would have to take care when calling to Grace during that summer at the house. The girls had received positions, to their dismay, in separate schools. Worse yet, Grace's position was in a mixed second-level school where girls and boys were of an age to be cruel at the expense of her girth. Grace rarely saw her friend, oh yes, on weekends or for an occasional dinner on Wednesdays, but it was not the same as the 9 years they had spent together in school. Grace was blue and began to eat more, and began to top off at 145 kilos. Grace entered class one day to find one of the more astute boys, a favorite, leading the class in a mockery of one of Grace's pronunciation exercises. The class howled as the boy stretched his lips forward and out and around, and rolled his eyes like a sow being slaughtered, and shoved bread from his lunch in his mouth, and patted his extended stomach in satisfaction at his jest. Grace had sat quietly in the last row of desks and waited as the class simmered. Then, without making comment as to what had been witnessed, Grace reminded them of the vocal assignment due the following week. Grace then moved to the piano, and, back to the students, led them through scales, while tears dropped silently onto moving fingertips. That evening, Grace called on her, but she was at a meeting of teachers in her own school. Grace badly needed consolation, but had developed no other human contact now for 12 years. Sitting unhappily in front of the vanity mirror, looking unhappily at the oversized face, fully focused, slightly distorted by tears, Grace wanted to die, but did not have the courage or the wherewithal to commit suicide. So Grace simply vowed to never eat again, to starve, die starved, and starving. At the same moment, Grace's friend sat among a group of incredibly stoic men and observed her reflection in their eyeglasses. She was the only woman on the faculty, had been told only that day that she had merely been an experiment of which a conclusion had come. This evening the faculty of men would vote on whether to keep her on. She was appalled that her fate lay in the hands of a group of men with shriveled minds, shriveled wives, shriveled sexual organs, so that they were actually afraid of her, and she knew she was to be sacked. She despised the note of pity in the headmaster's voice as he had told her earlier in the day. "You must be prepared for the worst, my dear. I know your value to this institution.
but you have insisted on segregating yourself from the other faculty, and frankly, they can see no reason to keep you on in favor of any man who could do equally well. However, you shall have my good recommendation. You should have no troubles finding a situation in a respectable girls' school.
But she had only touched the carnation in her lapel and thanked him for his forewarning. She did not point out that she was forbidden to use the teacher's lounge, as it resembled an exclusive men's club. She did not mention that her attempts to hold intelligent, educated conversations with her peers were always met with condescension rather than enthusiasm. And so, at the meeting, she did not allow the question of her tenure to be presented. She quietly removed the flower from her lapel, laid it on the table before them, resigned on the spot. In 2 short words, "I resign." She turned and walked out the door and took a coach home. The remainder of the term she applied to 3 schools, girls' schools run by respectable women. The third, the most prestigious school in the city, staffed entirely by aging nuns, accepted her because she was an alumni. They remembered her well. They were retiring their current Latin teacher, and with increased enrollment, brought on by scholarships made available by the carnation business, an additional French grammar class would be added on in the new session. She found herself in the September session being a strict teacher, more straight than the nuns, and it was because she worked among nuns she felt the need to be so. Her students began the semester thinking she would be a relief from the whip-cracking sisters. She found their discipline to be despicable the first day. She allowed them this day, did not act or react. She wanted to present a clear contrast between behavior that was not acceptable and behavior that was expected. The next day she went about the room, walking up and down the aisles, plucking the pink carnation from each lapel, dropping it to the floor, grinding it under the neat gray heel of her neat gray shoe. She then went to the board and began declining nouns. The next day she began class in the same way, grinding the flowers one by one, and then without comment beginning the lesson. The next day the same. By Friday, the nuns would not give these girls fresh carnations because they did not believe they had been destroyed by this teacher. The girls sat flowerless in their seats as she walked among them and gave each a fresh white carnation from the bouquet she held in her arms. Then she began declining nouns. The class didn't like her more, but they respected her beyond their parents, beyond the nuns, beyond the school. If only she had taught music, they might have loved her. She learned about Grace's death in the middle of the term. Although she had been busy, she had called Grace several times, but Grace had always declined invitations to dinner, to the theater, to anywhere. She felt dismayed. Perhaps they were growing away from each other, as childhood friends often do. She consoled herself by thinking that childhood friends who grow apart often meet on the street by coincidence, hardly recognizing one another, to start anew friendships that become more enduring than the time before because of the time apart. When she next saw Grace, she hardly recognized her. Lying in silk in the small, dark wood box, Grace had wasted away, seemed to have begun decomposing before her body had lost its spirit. She didn't weep, for it was not in her character. She did feel as though she would not have so close a relationship as she had had with that Grace. Her mother cursed herself for having called her only friend such, if only in private thought, and hoped hopelessly that she would find another social companion, then could not help but think that it would take 2 to fill Grace's shoes, and scolded herself again. She lay in bed, cold, colder than she had ever felt, and felt she had had such a tenuous hold on life, on her body after all, that her illusions of self-control and discipline were indeed only illusions. She feared she would not make it out of bed to give classes the next morning. She had never been ill before, had never missed class as a student, had never missed class as a teacher. Now at 77, she felt as if her body felt, as if it had spent its time. She was truly startled the next morning when she awoke and found Grace standing at her bedside, holding out to her a white carnation.